Hi, I'm Hunter Newby, and this is AFTV. I am joined by Grant Kirkwood, CTO Packet Exchange. Grant, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you. We're here at ITW, May 2010 in Washington, D.C. Weather's halfway decent now. It's a little muggy down in D.C. usually this time of year. So anyway, thanks for joining us. I had prepared some questions to discuss infrastructure, both backhaul and relationship to fiber and Ethernet, so let's just get right into it.
Okay.
What's the relationship between dark fiber and backhaul in general to you?
So I think that dark fiber is really the enabling piece of the backhaul equation. Without dark fiber to backhaul locations and to their core network POPs, there's really no way to get bandwidth out to where the end users physically sit or stand or walk in the case of wireless. That ultimately that's enabled by dark fiber. As complex content is driving increased bandwidth utilization and demand, things like video and audio streaming and voice over IP are using more and more bandwidth, and without dark fiber, none of that can be enabled.
So how does wireless backhaul, and I think you just sort of touched on that, but how does wireless backhaul impact that relationship between backhaul and dark fiber, and your business specifically if it crosses over?
Sure. So many of our customers are content producers, and they're sending out content and data and audio and video over the internet. But what's happening is there's been a pretty dramatic shift to mobile broadband users, whether on iPhones and iPads and things like that. And as those rich media applications move out to the mobile networks, the bandwidth requirement going back to the data centers and co-location facilities is increasing exponentially. So just as a real example in our business, we have a large audio streaming service that most people are familiar with for listening to music on their computers. And earlier this year was the first time that they had more signups for their service via mobile devices than on traditional desktop computers.
Wow.
So the shift is definitely moving into that mobile realm. So again, having sufficient backhaul capacity to wireless sites is very important for our business.
Wow, that's amazing, by the way. That
is.
sign up,
It is.
it's a trend beyond.
It's
It'll never go back the other way, right?
That's right. Exactly.
Incredible. So what role does Ethernet play in the present and future?
Well, with our company, we've been Ethernet-centric since our founding. And so at present, Ethernet is everything for us. In the future, though, I really see Ethernet being taken out to extend all the way from the data centers and content sources and corporate headquarters and corporate data centers out to the end sites, whether those are users, wireless backhaul sites, or enterprise locations. The Ethernet ubiquity represents the chance to have a really simplified technology base as opposed to combining SDH TDM circuits, converting them over to Ethernet and back and forth.
Yeah.
By having ubiquitous end-to-end Ethernet, it makes network management much simpler. It makes it much easier to scale bandwidth requirements instead of being limited traditional TDM bandwidth increments. So I think in the future it's going to enable the increased demand in bandwidth to be met much more easily.
Absolutely. So finally, do you believe the United States has the physical infrastructure at the fiber layer it needs to support all the Ethernet-based requirements for transport and backhaul? And if not, what do you think needs to be done?
I think that there's probably increased demand for fiber itself. There are limitations, even with the upcoming 100 gigabit standards, in terms of the amount of wavelengths that can be put over fiber. And from a very practical standpoint, there's probably very limited things that we can do to put more wavelengths than we're currently contemplating on physical fiber, which means at the point at which we run out of wavelength capacity at 10 or 40 or 100 gigs, while that sounds like it could be far off now, when that happens, then it's a matter of having physical fiber availability. And clearly, fiber resources in the ground are not infinite. So I think that in the future, we are going to need a lot more fiber than exists. As for what needs to be done to support that, I think the reach of dark fiber networks has to increase to the smaller Tier 2 and Tier 3 markets. I think that dark fiber is very easy to come from in the major metropolitan areas, but it's the more rural and smaller market regions that are going to see the same amount of bandwidth driven as the major markets that don't have that dark fiber access.
Yeah. That's interesting. I like that perspective. Thank you for sharing that. So let's focus a little bit now on packet exchange and your business. You know, how have you seen this year, you know, coming out of a pretty rough year, '09? How's 2010 been so far? And we're in May, so it's about the midway point. How do you see the remainder of the year working out for you?
So we're seeing a tremendous amount of growth. Just as an example, going back to our streaming audio client, they are growing by double-digit percentages on a monthly basis. And it's a very bandwidth-intensive application. So I think even without new customer additions, we're still seeing growth. So new customer additions are cumulative to that. And I think that the venture markets are starting to open up. I think that new media applications that maybe were a bit ahead of the curve a couple of years ago are suddenly having access to the technology and bandwidth requirements that they need to thrive. So I think the overall sentiment at Packet Exchange is very positive.
Is there some correlation between the percentage growth that you see and when you might foresee the exhaust of the available wavelengths on the fiber? I know it's kind of an outreach question, but if you could look at it in a petri dish and say, based upon our growth, if we're in this market and there was X much fiber and X many wavelengths, we'd reach the critical mass at that point.
I think we'd like that day to come tomorrow.
You're right, sure.
Because that means we're all very successful. But you know, it really has a lot to do with what happens with the 40 gig and 100 gig Ethernet, I think. There are still very significant distance limitations to overcome, as well as wavelength multiplexing at the 40 or 100 gig level. Those are going to present very serious technical challenges that have to be addressed before we can really see, I think, what the current infrastructure can support from a bandwidth perspective. But if I had a crystal ball, I would say that you know, probably here in the next 3 to 5 years, we could very feasibly hit a wall where we're going to need a lot more fiber than we have currently.
Good. Well, Grant, thanks so much for joining us here on AFTV.
Thanks for having me, Hunter.
Hope to see you again soon.
Thanks.